Richard Milhouse Nixon was born in Yorba Linda, California in 1913 to a modest Quaker family. His early years were shaped by hardship. Two of his brothers died young, and the Great Depression forced Nixon to work tirelessly on the family farm and at his father's grocery store. Excelling in debate, Nixon earned a scholarship to Duke University Law School. During World War II, he served in the Navy as a supply officer in the South Pacific, overseeing operations with thousands of tons of cargo, food, and ammunition. This logistical role honed his organizational mind and gave him a taste of responsibility in high-pressure environments, preparing him for the battlefield of politics. After returning from the war, Nixon set his sights on Congress in 1946, running as a Republican against Democrat Jerry Voorhis. Nixon's campaign capitalized on post-war fears of communism, distributing tens of thousands of pamphlets labeling Voorhis as soft on Soviet influence. Victory vaulted him into national politics, where he gained a reputation as an unrelenting fighter. In 1950, during his Senate campaign against Helen Gahagan Douglas, Nixon's team perfected red-baiting tactics, branding her as a communist sympathizer. His rhetoric mirrored the heated backdrop of the Korean War, where 1.7 million American troops battled with M1 Garand rifles and Sherman tanks, while Chinese forces poured across the Yalu with Soviet weapons. Nixon positioned himself as the political general of America's Cold War anxieties. Chosen as Dwight Eisenhower's running mate in 1952, Nixon was only 39, one of the youngest to ever reach such high office. When allegations of financial impropriety threatened him, he delivered the famous Checkers speech, named after the family dog he vowed to keep. Broadcast to 60 million viewers, it saved his career. As vice president, Nixon became Eisenhower's political soldier, visiting over 50 countries, reassuring allies, and confronting communist leaders face to face. In 1959, he clashed with Nikita Khrushchev during the kitchen debate in Moscow, defending American consumerism against Soviet central planning. Nixon also visited U.S. troops stationed in Korea, where 30,000 remained as a buffer against the North, and later in Vietnam, where U.S. advisors and weapons like the M16 rifle were beginning to shape a conflict that would define his presidency. Nixon entered the 1960 presidential race with formidable experience, but lost to John F. Kennedy in one of the closest contests in U.S. history. The first televised debates proved decisive. Kennedy appeared vigorous and confident, while Nixon looked pale and weary, having just recovered from illness. Kennedy won by fewer than 120,000 votes out of 68 million cast. 2 years later, Nixon's bid for California governor ended in defeat, leading to his bitter declaration, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Yet Nixon's retreat was temporary. The Cold War was intensifying, with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 and America escalating in Vietnam, where troop levels climbed toward 500,000 by 1967. Watching from the sidelines, Nixon carefully rebuilt his network, waiting for the political tide to turn. By 1968, America was in turmoil. The Tet Offensive had seen 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers launch surprise assaults across South Vietnam, shocking the American public. Over 500,000 U.S. troops fought overseas with helicopters, artillery, and napalm, yet victory seemed elusive. Meanwhile, cities at home erupted in protest and racial unrest following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Nixon entered the race promising law and order and a plan for peace with honor in Vietnam. Using his Southern strategy, he appealed to disaffected white voters frustrated with civil rights reforms. His narrow victory over Hubert Humphrey gave him 301 electoral votes, but just a 0.7% margin in the popular vote. Nixon now commanded a deeply divided nation, balancing Cold War pressures abroad with explosive social change at home. Nixon inherited a war that was draining American lives and resources. His policy of Vietnamization sought to withdraw U.S. troops while training the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, to take the lead. American troop levels fell from over 500,000 in 1969 to fewer than 30,000 by 1972. Yet Nixon escalated the air war, ordering massive bombing campaigns like Operation Linebacker, which deployed B-52 Stratofortresses dropping 20,000 tons of explosives on North Vietnam. In 1970, he expanded the war into Cambodia, sending 30,000 U.S. and South Vietnamese troops across the border to destroy enemy sanctuaries. The decision triggered massive protests at home, culminating in the Kent State Massacre, where National Guardsmen opened fire on students. Nixon's dual strategy, withdrawal and escalation, showed his cold calculation, but also deepened the sense of crisis. Nixon's greatest diplomatic triumph came in February 1972, when he became the first U.S. president to visit the People's Republic of China. Meeting Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai, he ended 2 decades of isolation between the world's most populous nation and the U.S. The handshake was a geopolitical earthquake, shifting the Cold War's balance. Shortly after, Nixon traveled to Moscow to meet Leonid Brezhnev, signing the SALT I Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. These moves cooled nuclear tensions at a time when both the US and USSR possessed over 20,000 warheads combined. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, North Vietnamese divisions equipped with Soviet tanks and surface-to-air missiles pressed hard against South Vietnam's defenses. Nixon's ability to play global chess while fighting a grinding war underscored his complexity as both a strategist and a gambler. Despite the Vietnam War's unpopularity, Nixon crushed his Democratic opponent George McGovern in the 1972 election. Winning 49 out of 50 states and capturing over 60% of the vote, Nixon's dominance seemed absolute. His campaign raised unprecedented sums of money, employing dirty tricks against rivals, including espionage and media manipulation. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared. In June 1972, 5 burglars connected to Nixon's re-election committee were arrested at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex. Initially dismissed as a minor incident, the burglary was the first thread of a scandal that would eventually unravel Nixon's presidency. While American B-52s still bombed Vietnam and peace talks dragged on in Paris, Nixon appeared untouchable. Yet his victory contained the seeds of his downfall. In 1973, the Watergate scandal erupted into a national crisis. Senate hearings revealed the existence of Nixon's secret Oval Office taping system. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox demanded the tapes, leading Nixon to order his firing in the infamous Saturday Night Massacre. Public outrage soared, and the Supreme Court eventually ordered Nixon to release the recordings. The tapes exposed his involvement in obstruction of justice, confirming suspicions of a cover-up. Meanwhile, U.S. forces had completed their withdrawal from Vietnam under the Paris Peace Accords, leaving South Vietnam's 850,000 army to face the North largely alone. The Watergate scandal consumed Nixon's presidency, destroying his credibility at home and abroad. By 1974, the House Judiciary Committee had approved articles of impeachment for obstruction, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Nixon's empire was collapsing. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon became the first American president to resign. In a televised farewell, he told his cabinet, "Those who hate you don't win unless you hate them back." His successor, Gerald Ford, soon issued a full pardon, sparing Nixon from criminal trial but igniting controversy. Retreating to San Clemente, California, Nixon spent years writing books, traveling abroad, and attempting to rebuild his reputation. He advised presidents from Reagan to Clinton, particularly on relations with Russia and China. When he died in 1994, world leaders, including Bill Clinton and Henry Kissinger, praised his strategic vision. Yet the shadow of Watergate remained, forever branding him as both a master of diplomacy and a cautionary tale of corruption. Nixon's rise and fall embodied both the promise and peril of American power.